Okay, welcome back to members of 121 Community Church in Grapevine, Texas, and our ongoing study in the theology of Karl Barth. We are currently looking at the Cambridge Companion to Karl Barth, published in 2000 by Cambridge University Press. We're going to take a look at the third essay in this volume. It's pages 57 to 72, and it's an essay on the use of the Bible by Professor Barth. Let's begin by looking at block 1. We're going to take a look at Scripture as outward movement. We begin with the strange new world within Romans that Barth discovered. The goal of exegetical study is to find and create correspondence between the proclamation of the Ecclesia Church and the rhema voice of Christ in Scripture. And for Barth, tradition and reason are always subordinated to the priority of the living Word, and all knowledge of the concept of God must be reflected off Christ as subject. And Barth is very strong on that point that he's always moving away from abstraction. So Christian doctrine is reflected off of Christ as subject, always. Now note too, Christ as Christological correspondence is enjoined by the form as Trinitarian and incarnate. In Scripture we encounter the klesis call of Christ as always particular and a personal address. It is initiated by the Father through the klesis call of the Son, and then enabled by the Spirit for the elect to hear and respond in thankfulness. There is an ongoing interest in seeking correspondence between human theological speech and divine speech act through Christ in Scripture. This ongoing form of address is always that which is enclosed in the promise and expectation of the Christ event. It is always enclosed within a promise and expectation. Now, our summary statement in 3 says that content as correspondence and form as Trinitarian both lead to attestation within God's revelatory act. Scripture becomes sign, or Scripture becomes signification, through its appointed role of being the outward movement of God's revelatory act. Scripture is the outward movement of God's revelatory act. And that is always an event. It's the self-disclosure of Christ as event. Scripture encounters us as the event of the self-disclosure of Christ. We are continually addressed in Scripture with Christ's klesis call, because the history of Christ cuts across all historical and all cultural distances. It is always made contemporary. That gives us our first theoretical inserted triad concerning Scripture. And we see that, first of all, Scripture presents Christ as subject. We encounter in Scripture the living word of the self-disclosure of Christ. And then 2, we are confronted with klesis call. We are personally addressed in Scripture in the Trinitarian modality of the Father, Son, and Spirit. And in that way, with the presentation of Christ as subject and the encounter of call, leads us to the Scripture as revelatory act. It becomes a signifying movement of Christ in his self-disclosure. It becomes a movement of self-disclosure. And it is always event. It is always the divine change of event in this revelatory self-disclosure. That gives us a theoretical aspect of Scripture. Now we're going to take a look at the concrete moment and the second moment. And it's going to be the concrete closing of soteriological distance, the fact that every historical and cultural distance is closed by the Christ event. And we learn that, first of all, the scope of word event in Scripture is presented to us. The Scriptures mediate the prophetic office of Christ in both Old Testament prophets and New Testament apostles. We are confronted with the prophetic office of Christ, His prophetic word. It is always Christ's prophetic word concerning the imminent advent of kingdom. Now, the scope of word event is fundamentally to point to Christ, just like the outstretched index finger of John the Baptist pointing to Christ. The history of Christ is articulated according to the Scriptures, and we learn this even at the time of the inauguration of his messianic office after baptism by John the Baptist. And Watson tells us in Luke 24:27 that this is illustrated where Christ unfolds the Old Testament Scripture concerning himself in the Gospel of Luke. So if you look at note 2, the scope of word event is enjoined by the magnification of word, and the word becomes magnified through concrete hermeneutic and practical application. Moving into the concrete realm, moving into the realm of practical application, is always that key moment of what Barth called magnification. It counts as magnification of the word. And we're given 3 axioms here. There's the axiom of pattern. There's a continuity throughout the Scriptures that attests to the pattern of Christ in his death and in his resurrection. The second axiom concerns the eschatological convergence. The prophets and the apostles both converge in the Christ event. And the third axiom is the axiom of intrinsic theologic. That's the way that Watson defines it in Barth. And in opposition to modern theology, text and truth are always dialectically related in Barth, and that interrelated aspect represents the intrinsic theologic of theology and Scripture. Therefore, in conclusion, the 3 hermeneutical axioms of pattern, convergence, and logic all equip us. They equip the believer for practical phronesis. Phronesis is practical wisdom, and praxis, which is practical act, which makes Scripture and theology concrete rather than abstract. Barth is adamant on that point, that we are to remain concrete in our theology and never reduce the Christ event to abstract notions. And so, note 3, scope of word event and concrete axiomatic hermeneutic both lead to negation of abstract norms and affirmation of practical phronesis and praxis. And that gives us our second inserted triad. Our second inserted triad, in the concrete moment, we note that Scripture presents a scope and a horizon that point to Christ in his personhood in the same way that John the Baptist pointed to Christ. Scripture is magnified as we take up the Scripture in practical phronesis, which is practical wisdom, and the praxis of practical ministry. And that leads to the concrete axioms of hermeneutic, which lead to we always negate abstract notions and always affirm and attest to Christ as subject. The Scriptures are an attestation to Christ as subject always, never to abstract notion. Now, in this lesson, in this essay, Watson did not give a third moment. What Watson did instead for the third moment is he gave us a appendix of biblical topics in the dogmatics, which can be researched by the reader. So he just gave us an expanded look at resources within the Christian doctrine, the Christian dogmatics, that really did address biblical references and the use of Scripture in Barth. So it's a short essay because it did not close with the third moment, but that will wrap up our third lesson in the Cambridge Companion, and we'll pick up next time on page 73.